lot of times we're talking to innovators in the space. Bitcoin is a moving target, and there's a lot of action happening around it. One of the areas that we don't focus on too much is kind of the funding mechanisms that make some of these improbable companies happen. So I'm joined this morning by Graham Lawlor, founder of Ultralight Startups. Graham, you're in the trenches on this stuff as far as actually connecting the companies that want to make these products, that want to perform these services, with the people who can actually provide the funding to make it happen. What's different about the Bitcoin space than other spaces you've worked in?
The level of excitement about Bitcoin is totally unprecedented in anything that I've seen in the 5 years that I've been running Ultralight Startups. We host pitch events where startups pitch to investors. Been doing that for 5 years in New York, Boston, Silicon Valley. We cover kind of all sorts of internet startups, e-commerce and social media and SaaS, enterprise businesses, everything under the sun, as well as energy and clean tech. But I've never seen a sector that has as much interest from VCs and from angels and also from the press, the mainstream press, as Bitcoin does. So I think that's the big difference that I've seen with Bitcoin lately. It's almost reminiscent, and this is what you hear when you talk to people that have been around for a while, is it feels a little bit like the mid-90s when the internet was the thing. And you had Netscape and the sort of the dot-com era, and that's the level of excitement that I think investors have about Bitcoin.
There was a lot of excitement during the dot-com era, but a lot of it was built on this premise that business model didn't matter. What mattered was eyeballs. You had these things like pets.com where they don't really have a way to be profitable, but yet they still achieve these high valuations. Do you think that there's a potential for a situation like that with Bitcoin?
Probably there is. I mean, I think if you look at some of these trends, and sort of the internet was probably the biggest one in the mid and late 90s, but we had sort of social media and SaaS and other trends as well that have had their own sort of run up and run down in terms of hype.
Of the companies that survived the dot-com era, there are not too many. There are a few, and those few that did survive have become very large. There were a lot of business models out there that never really had a model behind them. One of the things that when we talk to people about Bitcoin, there's kind of never that problem, because Bitcoin, being money, sort of has monetization literally built into anything that it's implemented into. You're running these pitch events. So what sort of businesses are you seeing coming into the Bitcoin space? What trends are you seeing emerge? What is it that people are focused on right now?
There's a parallel along the lines of what you're talking about in that back in the late 90s, and I'm old enough to remember this, anything with a .com in its name just had investor interest just because it was a .com. You saw companies, change their name from whatever to whatever.com, and all of a sudden their market cap would spike, 30% the next day just because it was a .com. I think that there's a little bit of that in Bitcoin. Anybody that's doing anything just has like a Bitcoin-induced bump in it. There's just so much interest, and people are really seeing the potential. They don't necessarily understand how it's all going to play out, kind of like they didn't understand how the internet was going to play out. They don't understand how people are going to end up using it, and how money is going to end up being transferred over the internet. What businesses make sense on the internet versus sort of bricks and mortar or traditional. It was just like the Wild West. Anything that had .com got venture funding, and sometimes at ridiculous, insane valuations. I wouldn't say we're quite there with Bitcoin yet, but I think that there's the potential to be. I guess to answer your other question, like what sort of startups are we seeing? We have 8 startups lined up for our pitch event next Thursday in New York on July 11th. You can see all these on ultralitestartups.com if you go there. But trading applications, we have BTX Trader and Atlas ATS. We have a wallet technology, Open Wallet. We have sort of a Bitcoin and other altcoin trading system called Crypto Street. We have Leetcoin, which I'm not sure if it is itself an altcoin or if it's a way to use Bitcoin.
The naming conventions are interesting, aren't they? You've got lots of companies that are Bit, and you've got lots of companies that are Coin, and so it's just like, I worked in the green space previously, and it's the same sort of thing there. There was a period of time where any company you looked at had green or clean or something like that in the name. And so it becomes very difficult to actually tell them apart.
That's right. Yes. Leetcoin is a company that allows Bitcoin to be built into games so that when you win a level in a game or get a prize in a game, you actually get Bitcoins from it, which I think is an interesting model. Lots of interesting companies in the space. I mean, we've seen remittance systems. I think we've got one or two of those on the lineup, trying to kind of span the gamut of what's possible, and what's out there.
So tell me about the investor side. It seems like right now there's a hunt for yield and there's a hunt for good investments. So, I mean, is Bitcoin just the only thing out there, or is it a hot area, relatively speaking? I mean, where are we on that? Why is Bitcoin seeing so much attention from investors?
See, I think Bitcoin fits the venture capital model really, really well because, the structure of venture capital as an asset class is different from other asset classes. It's fundamentally different from real estate or hedge funds or private equity or public equities in that it's very high risk. Most venture capital investments fail, most startups fail, and therefore, if you're a venture capital firm, you're investing in 10 startups, you can expect 5 of them to fail outright, another couple to kind of just return their original investment capital. So therefore, the 1 or 2 that are left that are big successes need to be huge successes in order to pay for everything else. And that's kind of the nature of venture capital. Venture capitalists are always looking for something with a minimum of a 10x return or a 20x return, such that if it works out, it pays for all the losers, which they know they're going to have. It's inevitable. And that's different from all the other asset classes. So they seek out very high risk, very high potential technology sectors. And I think Bitcoin is a perfect fit for that. And it's a perfect fit for venture capital. It's so disruptive that if it works out and if a technology works out, there's plenty of room for 10x or 20x returns to pay for the losers in a VC's portfolio.
What's the story with that risk tolerance there? Because, on the one hand, Bitcoin companies make sense because they have that growth potential, but then on the other hand, they have a lot of risk, from the perspective of the regulatory system. We don't really know what the rules are going to be in 2 weeks, a month, a year, and they could be different at each time as you kind of go along that timeline. How, as an investment company, can you deal with that risk? How do you plan for something like that where it's so uncertain?
It's a great question. A VC needs to get in when it's kind of unknown like this, because once everything shakes out and we know what the regulations are and sort of some of that risk declines, then it becomes a less risky asset class, and other investors start to get in, or the potential returns start to decline. It's kind of like the VC's business to go into something explicitly when it's risky. They can mitigate that risk through a few different techniques. I mean, some of the very large VCs actually have an entire operational staff that might be experts in financial services regulation and might, if they have a lot of Bitcoin companies in their portfolio, help to lobby on their behalf or help to navigate the legal system to find a niche that those companies can operate in legally. And the VC itself will help the startups in the portfolio navigate through that.
The risk is the opportunity because they're good at dealing with the risk.
I think that's exactly right.
So you've got your first one of these coming up. So based on the response you've received from this first Bitcoin-focused startup pitch event, what do you think the timeline is going out on this? Is this something you're going to be doing on a regular basis? Do you think there are enough Bitcoin concepts to justify this on a regular basis?
I sure hope so. Like, as I said, we've done pitch events every month in New York for over 5 years now. This is our first Bitcoin one, and it's really driven by my own personal interest. And we did a lot of work to find, I think we had 20 companies apply to present, and there'll be 8 sort of finalists that are actually presenting at the event next Thursday. We did a lot of work working with sort of local Bitcoin meetups, and there are several in New York right now. Bitcoin VCs, there's a couple of Bitcoin VCs in New York, or national services or news groups or social media to drum up interest for this. The applications actually came in from quite far away. They're not all from Metro New York City, but we've got somebody flying in from Vancouver, for example. I think we have somebody coming in from Las Vegas to present. So that's great. My hope is that there's a lot more local Bitcoin startups in the future, and that if we were to rerun this type of event in 6 months, let's say at the end of 2013, that there'll be enough locally we can get a steady stream, and it's not too difficult, just like we are for all the other startup sectors. There's plenty of interest, and I think there's people out there just trying to figure out what to work on, what's next, where the opportunities are, and I hope that things like our pitch event and upcoming conferences are going to help to solve that and let people know where the opportunities are, and that's where the startups are going to emerge.
So for somebody who maybe has a great business concept in the Bitcoin space that they think might be something that people would want to invest in and that they would want to throw their time behind for a couple of years, can you tell me exactly how these pitch events go? What's the process for a startup participating in one of these?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you about the event itself, and then I'll tell you about the application and selection process. So the event is a 2-hour-long evening event. We have 8 startups pitch. There's a panel of 4 VC investors, and the audience is usually about 200 people. Each startup has 2 minutes to present its idea and business model. Then the panel has 3 minutes for Q&A with each startup, and then the panel has another 3 minutes of advice back to the startup. So each panelist goes down the line and says, if I were you, here's what I would do to take your business to the next level. So we go through the monologue pitch, the Q&A, and the advice from the panel for each startup. We'll do 8 of those. We have sort of a networking section at the beginning, and then halfway through the pitches after 4 of them. At the end of the pitches, the audience votes on their favorite startup in real time by an online form, and we announce the winners, and the winners get some prizes. Not cash prizes, but prizes from our sponsors and partners. We have one Bitcoin specific prize we just announced, which is with Reddit. So the winning startup gets $200 in advertising credits on Reddit's Bitcoin page.
You mentioned that the winning startups get prizes at the end of it that are, that are valuable but not money. So these are pitch events. Do people get funded from these?
People sometimes get funded. We don't really advertise that as the objective of the event. Really, the objective for the startup is more to get the feedback from the investors and to get exposure to this big community. So a lot of times if a startup is presenting to a VC or to an angel investor, independently offline in their office, the reaction 99 times out of 100 from the VC back to the startup is, that sounds interesting, call me when you have more traction, which is kind of this very generic, lukewarm answer. They don't want to completely say, no, that's a stupid idea, we'd never invest. They get sort of a bad reputation for saying that, and there's always a chance that every startup that comes through the door turns into something big down the line, so they don't want to completely shut the door. So that's why they give that sort of a lukewarm response to everything. Whereas at our pitch events, the investors are required to give their questions and kind of probing into the technology and the business model, and then give this advice, this sort of actionable, if I were you, here's what I would do advice, which is something you never get at an independent meeting. And that's really valuable. So a lot of times, entrepreneurs come in and they get that advice. You should go after this vertical, or you should go after this niche, or partner with this big corporation, or talk to so-and-so about a strategic alliance, or whatever it is. And it's very concrete, very actionable advice back to the startup. And that's the core value that they don't get anywhere else. And then also it's exposure to a huge community. So all the people that are in this room are interested in Bitcoin, and they're working on some element or some aspect of it. A lot of times people presenting get connections to various types of partners and associates by pitching there. So that's really the value. Sometimes they get investment, and that absolutely happens. We don't really track that very rigorously, but we know that a lot of our startups do go on to get funding. I think about 20% get angel funding and about 6% get venture capital funding after having pitched at Ultralight.
Graham Lawlor, founder of Ultralight Startups. Thank you very much for your time.
Excellent. Thank you, Adam.
You are listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin, the premier audiocast providing news and insights that cover the rapidly evolving world of digital money. Our twice-weekly shows include analysis of late-breaking news, updates on key technical, business, and regulatory issues, and in-depth interviews with the key people driving the new digital economy. Let's Talk Bitcoin offers sponsors an attractive way to reach a targeted and savvy audience. For more information, email sponsors@letstalkbitcoin.com.